There's something nobody tells you about attraction, and it's a little uncomfortable to hear. The more available you make yourself, the less he wants you. Not because he's cruel, not because men are impossible to please, but because desire, real desire, doesn't live in certainty. It lives in tension. And the moment you eliminate the tension, you quietly eliminate the fascination too. Think about that for a second. Because most women do the opposite of what actually works. They're responsive, considerate, flexible, genuinely trying to show up well for someone they like. And those are beautiful qualities. But there's a version of that behavior that crosses a line, almost invisibly. The version where you cancel your plans because he sent a vague "what are you up to?" The version where you reorganize your entire week around a man who hasn't even asked you to. Where you become, slowly and without realizing it, the person whose life stops when his attention arrives. And here's the uncomfortable irony. Men who are emotionally mature, grounded, and genuinely high value, they feel that. Not consciously, maybe, but instinctively. Constant availability reads to them as the absence of a full life. And a life that revolves around someone else's attention is, in a very quiet way, a life that lacks its own gravity. Schopenhauer wrote about desire as something that can only exist in the space between longing and uncertainty. When there's no uncertainty, when everything is already handed over, there's nothing left to long for. And without longing, there's no spark. That's not a cynical observation, it's just honest. The thrill of earning something, of working toward a person who isn't simply waiting to be claimed, is neurologically real. Dopamine doesn't spike at predictability. It spikes at the possibility of something you're not quite sure you'll get. Which is why so many genuinely warm, generous women find themselves confused and hurt. They gave everything early, their time, their energy, their full emotional world, and somehow that investment was met with distance, or silence, or a slow, inexplicable fading. They did everything right, and it still fell apart. What no one explained to them is that doing everything right, too soon, too completely, can quietly undo the very dynamic that creates lasting attraction. This isn't about playing games. I want to be clear about that, because the moment this idea gets oversimplified, it becomes something hollow and a little cruel. There's a version of be mysterious that turns into emotional unavailability, cold behavior, and calculated manipulation. And that's not what this is. That approach doesn't work, and more importantly, it doesn't come from a healthy place. What actually works is simpler, and in many ways more demanding. Having a life that is genuinely full. Passions that existed before him. Friendships that don't disappear when you start dating someone new. Ambitions that don't pause because someone appealing walked into the room. When a woman's life has that kind of density, that kind of self-directed richness, she naturally creates intrigue because she genuinely has something beyond the relationship. She isn't performing mystery. She's living it. And men feel that difference. A man who has cultivated his own life, who takes himself seriously, who moves through the world with some degree of intention, he doesn't want to be someone's entire world. He wants a partner who is already someone, who has a story already in progress, who is interesting to him, not because she makes herself available, but because she makes him curious. The unspoken message a fully lived life sends is, I chose to include you. That's magnetic, that's real. Cleopatra understood this, though she'd probably roll her eyes at being used as an example in a YouTube script. But the point stands. Her power didn't come from yielding. It came from a quality of self-possession, so complete that proximity to her felt like a privilege that had to be earned. She understood that revealing everything collapses the tension, and without tension, there's no pursuit. Without pursuit, there's no real desire. Modern research in social psychology reflects the same pattern. Perceived independence increases desirability, and women who maintain clear personal boundaries consistently register as more attractive to high-value partners. None of this is accidental. Kant argued that curiosity is fundamentally driven by the tension between what is known and what remains just out of reach. Applied to attraction, that tension becomes fascination. The woman who is partly legible, partly mysterious, whose depths you sense but haven't yet mapped, becomes something a perceptive man wants to understand over time. She's not a moment. She's a story unfolding gradually, and that keeps him engaged in a way that immediate full disclosure simply cannot. Consider what this looks like day to day, because it's not dramatic, it's not distant or cold. A text takes a little while to come back because she was actually doing something. A meeting requires planning because her schedule is genuinely full. Her emotional world has other dimensions: friendships, work she cares about, a private interior life she doesn't feel compelled to narrate entirely. That isn't cruelty. That's depth. And depth, communicated through behavior rather than words, is one of the most quietly powerful things a woman can offer. The contradiction worth sitting with is this. Men often say they want openness and honesty. And they mean it. But not in the way it's usually interpreted. The honesty they're drawn to isn't total disclosure. It's the honesty of genuine presence, emotional authenticity, and the confidence to reveal yourself in layers rather than all at once. A woman who shares everything immediately, who leaves no room for curiosity, who exhausts the story before it's had time to develop, she removes the very thing that makes him want to keep showing up. A woman who reveals selectively, who allows desire to build, who trusts that she doesn't need to offer everything up front to be chosen. She creates a different kind of dynamic entirely, one where he's genuinely engaged, where earning closeness means something to him, where he's not just occupying space in her life but actively working to be in it. Which brings us to something deeper than mystery alone: autonomy. Because mystery without substance is just performance. What gives it real weight, what makes it genuinely irresistible rather than merely confusing, is the self-contained quality of a woman who has built a life on her own terms. Autonomy, in this context, isn't emotional unavailability. It isn't armor. It is, and this distinction matters enormously, the result of a woman who has taken herself seriously, who has pursued things that matter to her, who has cultivated her own sense of direction rather than deferring that work entirely to whoever she's dating at the time. This is what high-value men respond to most powerfully, though they often couldn't articulate why. When they encounter a woman whose life is already full, who has professional ambitions, real friendships, a worldview she's thought through, passions she'd have with or without a partner, they experience her as rare. And she is rare. Because that kind of self-possession is actually uncommon. It requires discipline and honesty about what you genuinely want, separate from the validation of romantic attention. Eleanor Roosevelt is worth thinking about here. Not as an idealized figure, but as a real example of someone whose authority came entirely from within. She wasn't waiting to be recognized. She didn't arrange herself around other people's approval. Her influence was the direct consequence of her own committed engagement with the things she cared about. That kind of presence is commanding in a way that no performance of mystery could ever replicate, because it's real. In everyday terms, autonomy looks like maintaining your schedule rather than abandoning it at the first sign of his interest. It looks like continuing to invest in your friendships, your career, your creative work, your well-being, not as a strategy, but because those things matter to you. It looks like allocating your emotional energy thoughtfully, rather than pouring it all into a dynamic before it's earned that kind of investment. And the effect on attraction is not subtle. It's significant. Because here's the thing about high-value men: they don't want to be someone's whole world. That's too heavy. It's suffocating in a way that erodes even genuine affection. What they want, what they're instinctively drawn to, is a partner whose life is worthy of integration. Someone who enhances their existence rather than becoming completely dependent on it. A woman who has that kind of self-sufficiency doesn't just attract interest, she earns respect. And respect, combined with desire, is what actually sustains a relationship over time. The behavioral psychology here is interesting and worth understanding. Intermittent reinforcement, the pattern where reward is occasional and earned rather than constant and automatic, creates deeper attachment than consistent availability ever could. In romantic terms, this means a woman who responds selectively, who is genuinely engaged but not perpetually on call, who is present but not anxiously available. She triggers neurological patterns that sharpen attention and deepen investment. She becomes the catalyst for sustained pursuit. And crucially, she does this without trying to manipulate anything. She does it by simply living fully. There's a contradiction at the center of all this that I want to name honestly, because it trips people up. Men will often say they want closeness, openness, emotional availability, and they're not lying. But simultaneously, neurologically, instinctively, they're drawn to challenge, to independence, to the sense that the woman across from them is complete whether he's there or not. These two things seem to be in conflict, but they're not really. The resolution is this: anchor yourself in autonomy first. Build genuine depth and direction into your own life. Then emotional availability becomes a gift you offer from a place of abundance, rather than a default reaction born from the absence of other things to fill the space. That shift is everything. It transforms the dynamic completely. Instead of trying to secure his interest by making yourself maximally accessible, you create an environment in which his interest is earned, deepened, and sustained. Because it's directed at someone who genuinely has something to offer beyond availability. Now, all of this touches on something that needs to be said directly. None of these principles are about manipulation. That distinction isn't cosmetic. It's fundamental. There's a version of be mysterious that becomes a performance, constructing a persona, playing emotional games, withholding in ways designed to cause anxiety rather than to reflect genuine self-possession. That approach is hollow, and it always collapses eventually, because there's nothing real beneath it. What works, what lasts, is the authentic version. The woman who is genuinely self-directed, who doesn't overshare, not because she's performing restraint, but because she trusts that her depth will reveal itself in time and doesn't need to be announced. Who maintains her boundaries not as strategy, but as the natural consequence of respecting herself. That kind of woman doesn't need to execute mystery as a tactic, because she embodies it as a quality of character. And that is immeasurably more powerful. The ethical dimension here is real. Women who confuse aloofness with power often end up creating confusion and resentment rather than attraction. The goal is never to destabilize someone emotionally or to use uncertainty as a weapon. The goal is simply to show up as a full person, one whose life doesn't pause for romantic attention, whose emotional world has genuine dimensions, and whose presence in any man's life is a choice rather than a need. That version of mystery, grounded, warm, authentic, and self-possessed, is the version that actually draws high-value men in and keeps them there. What does this look like practically? It looks like maintaining your personal commitments even when he texts. It looks like sharing parts of yourself incrementally, rather than exhaustively, on the first few conversations. It looks like having opinions you'll hold to even when challenged. It looks like being warm without being anxious, present without being reactive, interested without being consumed. Small, quiet behaviors that communicate something enormous. She is already someone. She is already complete. Being with her is a privilege, not a solution to her loneliness. The effect of all this extends well beyond romantic attraction, by the way. Women who develop these qualities, measured communication, genuine self-possession, the discipline to reveal themselves selectively, find that these capacities serve them everywhere. Professionally, socially, in how they carry themselves in rooms that used to make them feel like they needed to prove something. The magnetism that draws high-value men is the same quality that commands respect in every other context, because it comes from the same source. A woman who has taken herself seriously enough to build something real. Nietzsche, and I realize that's a somewhat unexpected reference here, wrote about the allure of the unattainable as a catalyst for human striving. The idea being that desire intensifies when effort and some degree of uncertainty are part of the equation. Without challenge, without the sense that what you're pursuing is not simply going to arrive without effort, desire flattens. Applied to attraction, this means that the woman who maintains her own landscape, her own priorities, her own complexity, her own refusal to be immediately conquered, activates something deep in a high-value man's psychology. Not antagonism, not cruelty. A genuine invitation to engage, to earn, to rise to meet someone worth the effort. Elizabeth Bennet understood this, even if she wasn't doing it strategically. Her intelligence, her wit, her willingness to hold her ground, even in the face of Darcy's intimidating social position. These weren't calculated moves. They were the natural expressions of someone who took herself seriously. And that is precisely what made her irresistible to a man who had never been genuinely challenged before. The lesson from literary heroines isn't that you should perform defiance. It's that authentic self-respect is more captivating than any performance of it could be. The challenge, then, and this is worth sitting with carefully, isn't to become harder or more withholding. It's to become more genuinely yourself, to invest seriously in your own life, your own development, your own sense of direction, to show up in romantic dynamics from a place of fullness rather than hunger. That is the actual work, and it's more demanding than any game because it requires honesty about what you want, about what you've been doing, about whether the version of yourself that shows up in early relationships is actually you, or someone shaped by anxiety about being chosen. Here's what it comes down to. Desire lives in tension. Fascination lives in incompleteness. Lasting attraction lives in the space between presence and depth, where a man can feel your warmth, but sense that he hasn't yet reached the bottom of who you are. That space is not manufactured. It is the natural byproduct of a woman who has built a life that is genuinely worth discovering. Mystery, in that sense, is not a tactic at all. It is simply what a full life looks like from the outside. The final reflection is this. High-value men are not drawn to women who hide. They're drawn to women who preserve complexity, who understand that not everything needs to be shared immediately, that desire grows in the space between what is known and what is still emerging, that the most magnetic version of yourself is the one that is already complete, already directed, already alive in ways that have nothing to do with whether or not he showed up. That woman is not playing hard to get. She's simply too genuinely invested in her own life to be easily gotten. And that, quietly, unmistakably, is everything.